Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today is going to be an addendum to the video I just recently made called How the Oral Torah Proves and Establishes the Written Torah. Okay, so just to go back over what was presented in the previous video, because it's going to be important to understand as a part of this video, and that's the meaning of the word Torah. So often people who don't know Hebrew will, are kind of under the impression that the word Torah just simply means like the law, like someone says the law of Moses, or that the Torah, it only means like the written Torah, like the text itself is called Torah and that's it. In reality, linguistically speaking, as I presented, in the previous video and what's shown here also, is that the word Torah can mean teaching, law. It can also mean something that like if it has a definition, designation, a character, or nature. The word has several meanings, and the reason for that is because, as I mentioned, also is because in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, more than modern Hebrew, the definition of words comes from what's called a shoresh, a three-letter root. So, for example, the three-letter root for the word of Torah comes from yud resh he, which means to cast or shoot. So often the word can form verbs that deal with like shooting an arrow or hitting a target. And when it's in a form of a verb called a hifil, bahora, which means to instruct or teach, the word Torah would mean instruction, direction, precept, law, mode, or manner. So, for example, it isn't strict to, the idea of there's a text, that's called the Torah. Um, and then that's it, but any kind of teaching, any kind of instruction. So if I were to verbally instruct someone, that's like the Torah of, Ehav Ever, if you will. If I were specifically to give, instructions on how to like, actually do things in the Torah, that's also the Torah. And because it's all verbal, it would be an oral Torah. So for example, someone may look at the written Torah and say, okay, well, the text says an amah for a measurement. Well, how long is an amah? Well, then I have to explain it because the text itself never explains what an Amma is. So my explanation is an oral Torah. It's an oral instruction, direction, precept. So when people, for example, have this impression that there's only this written text and that there's no oral instruction in the text and nobody ever instructed anybody beyond what's written in the text, that's problematic because of the fact that, before the text was ever written, everything was all oral. And it was only written like years after all the oral instructions of how to actually do the mitzvot, the things that were commanded by Hashem and also Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, all of that came about, before there was actually a written text when Moshe Rabbeinu wrote down. And again, the written text is like a cliff notes, if you will. It's like the short version of what actually happened. And it never goes into full detail about every detail because, like I said before in previous videos, you would have to assume if all there was the written text and there was no oral explanation of anything inside of it that went into the written form of the text, that means that for 40 years, no one said anything except for what was written in the written text. Meaning that, for example, when Moshe Rabbeinu says, okay, we're going to build a Mishkan, nobody asked any questions because the text never records any questions about the building of the Mishkan. But obviously, there had to have been. Because one of the things that was instructed to Moshe Rabbeinu is that you'll have these particular individuals who lead it. So it's like, well, why do you have to have anybody lead it? I mean, it's written, it should be clear. It wasn't even written then, but if it's written down, it should be just clear what to do. But as I showed in a previous video, you could have something written down and still people ask questions of, well, what does this mean? Or I don't see how this part goes to that part, or I don't see how I'm supposed to do this from this. So there's always a oral element to every type of written instruction. And prior to there actually being a written Torah, there was also oral instruction. And this is found within the whole Tanakh. So, as I've said before, when you go through and start looking and say, okay, well, how does the, culture of the, Israeli culture and also like, Jewish culture work? Well, those who are within the Jewish culture know that oral instruction, oral discussion, oral debate has been a part of the process for thousands of years. Because again, there's no scenario where Jews sat down, took out a written text and said, okay, let's read it and we're done. There's always discussion and debates. That's what most of the Talmud is. And part of the reason for that is because the generation who received these, instructions, is a different generation that was like coming after them years later. So there are things that someone who actually, let's say, built the Mishkan, would know compared to someone who wasn't there when it was built. There's things that would have to be explained. Okay, well, how exactly did you handle this when you smelted? For example, the smelting process for gold is never explained in the written Torah. But obviously, there had to been a process that was acceptable versus a process that was not acceptable. And that's true of any type of thing. When you do something, there's always an acceptable way to do it and a way to do it that's incorrect. There's always a process of saying, okay, these things are the standard and these things are not the standard. So then one of the arguments that some people sometimes make is, okay, well, there's no place in the Tanakh, the rest of the Tanakh, or even the Torah, that's, ever shows an oral Torah. And in the previous video, I dealt with that a little bit in terms of how to even identify the written text based upon the oral Torah, meaning that this is what you see here in front of you is a Sefer Torah. And this is one of the things I find when people make this claim, they normally can't read a Sefer Torah. They actually, if you put this in front of them, most of them wouldn't be able to read it. With the exception of some Karaites, but even the reading itself is an oral Torah because there's oral instructions of what the correct pronunciation is versus an incorrect pronunciation. And pronouncing the text incorrectly, given that the text has no markings for vowels or punctuation, could change the whole meaning of the text. So I want to deal with something that people like often say that there's no places in the prophets or the writings where the oral Torah is ever discussed. So let's take a look at something in particular and see if there's no discussion of an oral Torah. So let's go to the book of Nehemiah, where, just the backdrop of the story is that after the first exile, when the first temple was destroyed, and Jews who were exiled to Babylon, who were the leadership in the government as well as the Kohanim of the area of Yehuda, the region of Yehuda, or Judah, as people will call it, the average, person living in Yehuda, the average Jew living in Yehuda, the average Israeli living in Yehuda, was not exiled during that time. It was predominantly the government. So for example, the kingship, anyone related to the kingship, the government, the Sarim, anyone related to the Kohanim, the temples destroyed, those are the people who were exiled. So upon returning, Ezra HaKohen, or Ezra in English is the same, is basically in a situation where he's got to bring everybody back up to speed, meaning that they've been in exile for about 70 years, and that now you're rebuilding the temple. Now you're trying to reinstitute, the lifestyle of keeping the Torah. So one of the things it mentions in Nehemiah chapter 8, which is in Hebrew is Het, and verse 2, which is Pasuk bit. And starting here at the top, again, Hebrews read from right to left. It says, Vayavo Ezra HaKohen et Torah lifnei HaKahol. So basically, Vayavi Ezra HaKohen et Torah lifnei HaKahol. So Ezra brought the Torah in front of the community, in front of the people who were gathered there. Me'ish va'ad isho, וכל מבין לשמוע ביום אחד לחודש השביעי. So essentially, from men to women, everybody basically was there to basically understand and listen to the Torah, and that was on the first day of the seventh month. So it says going on into verse 3 or pasuk gimel. ويقرأ לפני הרחוב אשר לפני שער המים מן האור עד מחצית היום נגד האנשים והנשים. So it says, he basically read, from it, in front of, basically the people who were there, in front of like the gate of the water, from, basically negative in front of, it's like negative, it's like in front of the men and the women. And it says this part here where I have highlighted says Wahamivinim wa'oznei chol ha'am el sefer Torah. So essentially, this word here means, and it's what do you call that? Almost like a causative type of verb. It says Wahamivinim. So Wahamivinim means that to cause someone to understand. Then it says wa'oznei chol ha'am. So he orally, because it's to the ears, wa'oznei chol ha'am, in the ears of all the people were towards like the Torah, the written Torah. Okay, so he took the written Torah, he took a Torah scroll like what you saw in the previous video, and he starts reading it, but then he starts explaining what's like there so that the people understand it, because he's causing them to understand. That is an oral instruction. That is oral Torah. Now, someone make a big point. Well, it doesn't say oral Torah. Well, of course not. That's like, the terminology of like the term oral Torah is a later term, but it's a term discussing this word here. In other words, we'll see in just a second. So anytime, for example, the Torah says, yomer, wadaber, that is oral Torah. And the term oral Torah is simply describing that for a later generation who use that terminology to discuss what those terms collectively mean. So if we continue in verse 5 of the same chapter 8, it says, وَيِفْتَحْ Ezra HaSofer لَعَيْنَي كل העם. And basically, basically it's like saying that, Ezra, opened up the scroll, in front of the people, in front of the people where they could see it, not in front of the eyes of the people. And it says, Ki me'al kol ha'am hayom, uchtitho, amadu kol ha'am. So basically, he opened up in front of the people, and the people like stood, So, um, basically, it's talking about okay, he's basically opening the Torah and he's reading from it. So continuing into verse 8, going forward, it says Vayikro'u besefer b'Torat Elohim. So he read from the Sefer of the Torah of Elohim, the basically of Hashem, mifurash, miforosh. So essentially, miforosh means to like also explain. It means to like break down the meaning, and this is also another explanation of Oral Torah. Whenever someone talks about Oral Torah, what they're also saying is it's an oral explanation, and miforash is the same kind of thing. He was orally explaining what was written in the Torah. So again, someone could say, well, wait a minute, if there's no Oral Torah, if all there is a written text, why would he have to explain anything? They should just hear the words and say, okay, we get it. We understand. We can go. You don't need to explain anything. But obviously, there had to be an explanation. And obviously, if there's is an oral explanation, that means that what's written there isn't fully clear to every single person who's sitting there, or else there'd be no reason to explain anything. People can just say, okay, you read the statement, we got it, we'll go do it. So it continues, it says, Wasom sechel wayovinu bamikro. So when it says wasom sechel, so sechel, one way to describe sechel is like a type of understanding or a type of intelligence. So it's like saying that, and then also the next one in the gray, Wayavino Bamikro. So it's like the explanation to help people understand what's written there. So essentially what you have here is him explaining, in order people to understand the Torah and also explaining so that they can, understand what's going on and, be able to actually do what's in it. So essentially, this is also an explanation of Oral Torah. Again, Oral Torah is just simply a term from a later generation to explain to what says here about Som Sechel or Yovino B'Mikro. So one way of saying it is, okay, well, what is Oral Torah? It's right in here. Meforash ala Torah, or Som Sechel ala Torah, or Yovino B'Mikro, so that someone can understand what's written there. And continuing, it says, Voyomer Nehomyo hu hatir shafo v'Ezra Kohen hasofer v'Haleviyim. So basically, like it talks about Nehemiah was there, and then also Ezra was there, and basically the Leviim. And it says they together, going here to the highlighted part, Hamivinim et ha'am lechol ha'am. So it says that they caused the entire people to understand. So they were causing them to understand what's written in the Torah. And again, there'd be no reason to do this if it's just, all there is a written text. Hayom Kodesh Hu Ladonai Elohechem Alatit Abalu. So essentially, he's telling people like, there's not supposed to be any mourning during this time. This is like, a set apart day for Hashem. And what they were being told to do was that this is a mitzvah for us to be able to, celebrate and have simcha. We're not supposed to be mourning during this time. So essentially, again, this is an explanation that there was an oral Torah because otherwise there'd be no explanation. There'd be no reason for them to explain what's in the written text so that people would understand it. Because again, the oral Torah is simply the explanation of actually how to perform what's written in the Torah and how to understand what's written in the Torah. So, a good example of this is the circumstance that they're in, having been exiled for 70 years and then coming back and having to like rebuild the temple. Well, you can have lots of questions. Okay, do we have to rebuild it exactly the way it was? And what was the exact way it was? This has been 70 years. We don't fully remember what they did and how they built it. How we're going to bring water from one location to the other. The circumstance we're in now is different. Although this is like a requirement from the Torah that they have certain things in place, but they're living in a different time frame than the original situation. So essentially, there has to be decisions that are made from a legal perspective, and there has to be an explanation of what the text actually is requiring. So going even further into verse 12, it says, "Vayelechu chol ha'am le'achol v'lishtot." So after the explanation they got of they're not supposed to be mourning on the day that they were on, that they're supposed to actually, eat and, like have, and to drink. And it says, "Ula shalach manoth ula asot simcho chodolo." So essentially they, were having, food, they were sending food and they were doing like, the observation they were supposed to do during that time. And they were having simcha, like a lot of joy. And it says, Ki hevinu hadavorim asher hodi'u lahem. So they understood after the explanation that Ezra and the others had made, what was there and what they were informed of what was they were supposed to do essentially. So again, this is the point. This is what an oral Torah even means. That is the oral explanation of actually have to do what's in the written text, as well as the oral explanation of what the mitzvot even are before the text was even written. So going even further into 13 and right here. It says, "Ubayom hashini na'asfu roshei ha'avot lechol ha'am hakohanim v'haleviim al Ezra hasofer ul haskil al divrei haTorah." So essentially, it says that the second day, they gathered everyone together, the leaders of the community, the roshei ha'avot lechol ha'am, so the leaders of each of the Jewish community, hakohanim v'haleviim, the kohanim, and then the Levim. El Ezra, they came to Ezra HaSofer, skill el divrei Torah. So essentially, to like if you has ul haskil would be to like to educate, to make them to understand, if you will, the words of the Torah. So again, another explanation of oral Torah. He is orally explaining to them so that they understand the written Torah, the words of divrei Torah. So the thing is that again, the written Torah came only after there was an oral Torah that existed. Moshe Rabbeinu is constantly being told by Hashem things that were like of oral nature. He was constantly orally explaining them, and then eventually over time he wrote something down that went out to all the leaders of the people, and even to the Levim. But until that point, even after that point, there's oral explanations. So this is like proof from the Nevi'im that there was an oral Torah, that the Torah itself had to explain. And this is why when you look at the three Jewish groups who can claim, like ancestry from the original giving of the Torah, that be Jews who hold by Torah Moshe, Orthodox Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Temenim, different Jews from different communities in North Africa, Ashkenaz, and then you compare it with Karaites. Karaites again say they don't agree with the Talmud being the Oral Torah, and they don't like the term Oral Torah, but they do have a system called Sevel HaYerusha, which I talked about in a previous video on Hekesh, which essentially Sevel HaYerusha is basically an oral transmission from father to son, or even like from teacher to student, about how to actually perform the Torah. And they call it the Pirush in the Torah, the same thing that's mentioned in this text earlier, the Meforash, that was mentioned in Ezra. So essentially, even if a person were to say, I don't agree with the Talmud, you can't get away from the fact that even to be able to understand Hebrew and to learn Hebrew, you had to have had it taught to you orally, especially given that the oldest written source of how to understand the written Torah and the Tanakh itself comes from the Talmud. And this is before the vowel points were even made. Like what you see in my text here, these are vowel points that were created, I would say probably like almost like 1,500 years ago or so, but they don't predate that. Prior to this, these little points here, these little dots you see here, these little marks here didn't exist. And these are vowels. So in order to read them prior to that, you'd have to have orally been taught what these words mean and what they sound like in order to read it. Because who's to say that this is le'achol and not li'ichol? Who's to say that this is not wilishtoth and instead walesh tooth or lesh tath. It could be any pronunciation. But all of these these markings here didn't exist to a certain point, and Hebrew was taught orally so that you could read a text that only had consonants and understand it. And again, we're told here that Ezra Sofer and the Kohanim and the Levim, as well as the leaders of the community, taught the people. And this is all oral tradition and oral Torah. So in conclusion, as you can see, and this is just a snapshot, you can literally look through the Tanakh and find all kind of places where there are descriptions of things that are oral Torah. And just because you can't find the term itself, oral Torah, again, in every generation, there's new terminology that comes about. And one good example of this, and this is something that people who know Hebrew would see more than someone who doesn't know Hebrew, because people who don't know Hebrew will say anything, if they were just told by somebody something. If you look at the type of Hebrew that you find in the Torah, the five books of Moses, as people say. And if you compare it to the Hebrew of, let's say, Yehoshua ben Nun, Joshua, and then you keep going further in the Tanakh, what you'll find is that the language is advancing. You'll find that the language of the Torah, you could easily understand that and not understand the language of the Nevi'im, especially the later Nevi'im. I've done this myself when I was like, trying to get better in my Hebrew years ago, where I would read the Torah and understand certain things. I would read Yehoshua ben Nun, understand certain things, and Yehoshua ben Nun is the book of Joshua. But then by the time you start getting to the Shoftim and Melachim, there's terminology that's being used that's different than what's in the Torah. So it's like it came from a later era. And if you go even further in like Yeshayahu, for example, and in Isaiah, the terminology used there, you could easily understand the Torah and not understand Yeshayahu in some places. So this is just a quick explanation, as quick as I can possibly do it, to help understand how the Oral Torah is mentioned in the Tanakh, but it's mentioned using the terminology of that time frame. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care and bye.